400 years ago, throughout the summer of 1605, a group of men spent their nights rowing back and forth across this river. They were religious extremists intent on carnage.
What they were doing was transporting barrels of gunpowder from a house further down the Thames up to the Houses of Parliament. Their aim was to blow up the building, and with it the king, his family, the nobility, the bishops, the MPs, in effect the entire English establishment.
It's what we all know as the Gunpowder Plot, and in the end, it failed. On the 5th of November, Guy Fawkes was discovered by guards in a vault below the House of Lords, about to light the touch paper.
This conspiracy had the potential for destruction on a 9/11 scale. Now, these men would be seen as terrorists. They were the Al-Qaeda of their day, Catholics. And their conspiracy remains one of the greatest threats to state security in English history.
We've never forgotten Guy Fawkes. We remember the 5th of November. But this episode clashes with everything the English think about themselves.
The English have a rooted belief that they have a long and glorious tradition of tolerance. Multi-faith, multi-ethnic, everybody welcome here. But Guy Fawkes Night is certainly not about live and let live. It's the symbolic enactment of burning a Roman Catholic, Guy Fawkes. It's a memory of a time when this nation was one of the least tolerant in the world.
In this series, I'm examining English identity, what it is, and how it's changed through time. In this programme, I'll be tracing the English attitude towards tolerance, looking at how they've treated those they've regarded as different. And I'll reveal there's been a profound transformation. The English have gone from being religious persecutors to pioneers of freedom of belief. Some might argue this change was inevitable, as religion lost its grip on society and secular ideals took hold. So the English became more civilized, more tolerant. I disagree. I believe the root of English toleration is to be found in its Christian history. But this is no simple story of love thy neighbour. It's been a journey of accident rather than design. It's often the fears of the English Church which have paved the way for toleration of different cultures and beliefs. This is the story of how the English discovered liberty and tolerance,
and the remarkable role that the Church played in it all.
Every year, people flock to Britain to start a new life.
Now, one of the things this country does really well is to invent brand new rituals. And one of the latest is a citizenship ceremony, which is for those who want to settle here. And I've come to Camden Town Hall just to see how it's done.
Could those becoming citizens please get together their photo ID and their invitation letter?
In these ceremonies, about 200,000 immigrants a year swear their loyalty to the UK. But I want to know what it is about England in particular that attracts them.
I came from Philippines, and the freedom of speech in our country is a bit limited. Unlike in England, you can voice out your own opinions freely.
I belong to a minority Muslim community. It's in minority in Pakistan, and there's a lot of persecution against the community as such. We're not very free to sort of practice the religion. And I think one of the things that I absolutely love about this country is that I feel free to do whatever I want to do.
What these folk think they'll find here is an indifference to difference, room to be themselves. England's reputation for tolerance is something the nation prides itself on. But before the English get too pleased with themselves, behind this modern-day story of freedom and individual self-expression, there is a rather more discreditable tale. The English once did persecution and intolerance in a way which would make any modern dictator proud. Yet, curiously, it was often strands from this dubious past which prompted the English to discover tolerance. And at the heart of that change was the Christian Church. In the City of London, there are traces of one of the first groups to experience persecution in England. These street names date to 1070, when William the Conqueror first brought Jews here from Normandy, with a single purpose: money lending. This was a time when medieval England was a proudly Catholic nation.
But the Catholic Church insisted that lending money at interest was a sin, and since everyone in England was a Catholic, that was a problem. So it was a stroke of financial genius on the part of King William to import a set of non-Christians to do the money lending. After all, what's it matter if Jews do the sinning?
But moneylenders are never popular. And in less than a century, things would turn poisonous. Anti-Jewish feeling in England can be traced back to the story of a horrific murder. On Easter Saturday, 1144, the dead body of a 12-year-old boy was found here. He was gagged and half naked.
His name was William, and he'd been missing since the previous Tuesday. Over the Easter weekend, people came out here from the city to gawp at the sight of the killing, and the rumours started. Some members of the family said that he'd been murdered by Jews, and that was horrific enough. But then the story came that he'd been crucified in mockery of the death of Christ.
The argument went that if, as the Gospels claimed, the Jews had killed Jesus, then it was in their nature to kill a child in the same way. It was the start of a toxic Christian myth known as the blood libel. A false accusation that the Jews murdered Christian children and used their blood in their own religious rituals. William was soon seen as a saint, and his body was brought here to Norwich Cathedral. His shrine has long disappeared, but I've come here to meet the historian Mary Rubin to discuss why the Jews were blamed for his murder.
Did the Jews really kill little William of Norwich?
No. And we have absolutely no evidence from the period that's at all reliable to suggest so.
So why do the Jews get the blame for it?
Well, just like we know from our own times, a child disappears, a child dies, it's absolutely appalling. You look to blame people, and families tend not to look at themselves, but rather to seek someone already thought to be evil or different or other. And the Jews are the only religious minority in England. So they're, the typical sort of outsider group in whose houses one can imagine appalling things happening.
So what were the consequences for the Jews of England?
Well, the story had a real afterlife, and very soon, indeed, the second half of the 12th century, we have a number of copycat cases, really, where it was rumoured that Jews might have been involved in the killings of little children, usually boys. We know also that in 1255 in Lincoln, such an accusation unfolds fully, whereby Jews of the city are accused, they're arrested, and ultimately executed. So over a century of the aftermath of Norwich, really, this becomes a very powerful, well-known, resonant narrative about Jews and what they might do to Christians.
The English had set in motion a devastating rumour, which spread across Europe, triggering pogroms and massacres of Jews, and not just in the medieval period.
In 21st century England, with its synagogues and flourishing Jewish communities, it's painful to acknowledge the English invention of this most poisonous of lies.
The English ruthlessly used and then abused the Jews. In 1290, they expelled them altogether, the first kingdom to do so in all Europe. But it wasn't just the Jews. The medieval English church hounded anyone who resisted official doctrine. Heretics were forced to convert to the Catholic faith, and if they resisted, they faced death. But what I find fascinating is what lay behind this systematic brutality.
It's too simple to dismiss these medieval Christians just as sadists or bigots. There was a good reason for persecuting non-believers.
And it stemmed from a fear of hell. In the leafy suburbs of Surrey, in a church dating back over 800 years, you can still get a glimpse into the terrifying fate that the 13th century English believed was awaiting them after death, if they failed to live exemplary Christian lives.
Paintings like this were the way that most Christians learned their Christianity, because they couldn't read or write, so pictures were everything. And this picture taught them their priorities. Now look at the middle of it. You've got this quite narrow white band. Now that is the here and now. That's where you and I live. And everything else is the afterlife. Now also look, there's a ladder. It goes in two directions, and upwards it goes to a distant heaven. But downwards, and look at those souls tumbling down into hell.
It was this fear of eternal pain in the afterlife which underlay English persecution of those who were different. If Jews, heretics or sinners failed to change their ways, they would be damned forever. So medieval Christians argued that forcibly converting such deviants to true Christian faith was an act of compassion.
We think that tolerance of all beliefs or none is a good thing. They thought it was wicked. You were preventing people getting to heaven. You were condemning them to hell. You were a murderer of souls.
It's shocking to realise that for the first 1,000 years of English history, what defined this nation was its intolerance of all who were different. Quite a contrast with this country today. But just as it was religious fear that sparked English persecution, so it was fear that also fired the English to become more tolerant. I'm heading to Italy to uncover why. Every Good Friday, this quiet Italian town is transformed by a unique religious ritual, dating back at least 1,000 years. The ceremony gives us a glimpse of what Catholic England would have looked and felt like 500 years ago. It begins outside the cathedral, and everyone seems to have turned out.
You couldn't imagine this happening in England, could you? What's different, I think, is the way in which church has sort of spilled out into the street. And yet, England was like that once. In the 15th century, the English were extrovert, emotional, they had great processions in the street. This was England about 1480.
Up until the 16th century, to be English was to be Roman Catholic, devoted to the Pope. But for many in secular England today, this Catholic pageantry comes from an alien and perhaps rather frightening world. All these hoods might suggest the stifling of free expression, the tyranny of Catholic belief. The received wisdom is that when the Catholic Church lost its grip on England, so more enlightened values began to flourish. That's when the English started to become a more tolerant nation. And this process is seen as beginning with the Reformation. In 1534, the Pope and Henry VIII fell out spectacularly over the annulment of Henry's first marriage.
England was going to break with Rome, and all this Catholic drama would disappear as if it had never been. Statues destroyed, all the holy objects burnt. 1,000 years of English history was going to be junked.
I agree that this Reformation was a watershed, and that the English eventually did become more tolerant. But it had nothing to do with supposedly more noble secular values. Quite the contrary. The road to tolerance is entirely tangled up with religion. The Protestant Reformation actually unleashed a new religious fear, this time of Catholics. And the funny thing is that that's what first pushed the English towards becoming a more tolerant people. Here, at one of Henry VIII's favourite palaces, you can get a taste of just how this hatred of Catholicism began. In one of the corridors is a chillingly brutal image, which set the tone for the next 4 centuries of English history.
King Henry commissioned this picture soon after he'd been excommunicated by Pope Paul III, and it's a real distillation of his rage into an allegory, a set of symbols. And the violence in this painting is extraordinary. There, the Pope is actually dying, and he's being trampled underfoot, he's being stoned to death. But I think the most surprising, in fact shocking, aspect of the painting is that the stones with which the Pope is being killed are labelled. And they're labelled with the names of the Gospel writers, as Matthew, Luke, Mark, and John. So the weight of true religion is killing the enemy of God, the Pope.
Early in Henry's reign, the Pope had honoured him as defender of the faith, the Catholic faith. This painting shows how far he'd strayed from that role. It was the first step in a process of demonisation of Catholics, which had far-reaching consequences for the English journey towards toleration. Henry had broken with Rome, but his son Edward opened the doors to Europe's new form of Christianity, Protestantism. But Edward died prematurely at the age of 16, and his half-sister Mary seized the throne. She was still a loyal Catholic, and enraged by Edward's Protestant Reformation, she launched a violent campaign of persecution. In 3.5 years, she had over 300 Protestants executed for heresy. And one man grasped the opportunity to record the atrocities. This is Fox's Book of Martyrs, a record of the burnings of Protestants, which began to push the fear of Catholicism out of the palaces and into the parishes of England.
The author of this book was John Fox. He was a Protestant clergyman who had to flee abroad under Queen Mary, and while he was in exile abroad he started collecting stories of the people who were being burnt at that time, and it became a bestseller, partly because of pictures like these.
And I think this is one of the most horrific.
It's 3 people, and one of them is a pregnant woman. She's tied to the stake and she is giving birth, and we know from the story that her baby was then thrown back into the fire.
The stories of the burning martyrs fanned equal flames of Protestant hatred. Catholicism was shown as pitiless, tyrannous and cruel. When Mary died, England officially became Protestant once more, under Elizabeth I. And across the country, Fox's book was placed in churches alongside the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer by government order. Fear of Catholicism was beginning to seep into the national consciousness. But the real nail in the Catholic coffin came during Elizabeth's reign, when a papal order transformed them into full-blown enemies of the state. In 16th century England, this was a place of terror. In 1570, the Pope excommunicated Queen Elizabeth, absolving English Catholics from any loyalty to her and her laws. It was a moment which cast ordinary Catholics as potential traitors. And this was where those accused of treason were held.
Well, this is a prison cell, but as you see, it's quite a luxury prison cell. It's got a fireplace, got windows. So that tells you straight away this was for high-status prisoners, dangerous people, attempted poisoners of the Queen, assassins.
And when you look closely at the walls, you can see Catholic inscriptions, carved by those who were locked up here.
Now, I think Catholics may well find this offensive, and rightly so, but if I say that the Elizabethan government thought of these people like Al-Qaeda, they are terrorists, and they are the worst possible danger to the crown.
If a Catholic was held here under suspicion, he knew what fate awaited him. Interrogation, torture.
And at the end of it all, hanging, drawing, and quartering.
And English suspicions of Catholic treachery were amply confirmed by conspiracies like the Gunpowder Plot. It was a dramatic turnaround. Henry VIII, Fox's Book of Martyrs, and the reign of Elizabeth had a devastating effect on how the English viewed Catholicism. Within a generation, it changed from being the only religion tolerated in England to being the religion of the devil. For the next 300 years, Catholics would be excluded from all positions of power, fined if they refused to worship in Protestant churches, and often treated with the utmost suspicion. But here's the strange thing. It was this Protestant religious bigotry that first got the English seriously thinking about the very possibility of tolerance. And it all happened in the wake of a bloody religious conflict that ripped England apart. This building still bears witness to the reasons behind England's descent into civil war in 1642.
The present Somerset House is essentially a very grand office block for 18th century civil servants. But its predecessor was a real royal palace for the wives of kings.
And below this great courtyard, one Stuart queen in particular has left her mark.
Now, this is called the Dead House because it's actually built over the site of a graveyard, and some of the gravestones are still here, built into the walls. Now, what strikes me straight away is that there is something very strange about this. This lady died in 1633, and yet she has a Catholic prayer for the dead. Pray God for her soul. Now, it was illegal to practice your Catholic faith in England at the time, and yet here are Catholic gravestones in a palace owned by a Protestant monarch.
The king in question was Charles I, and it was his wife, Henrietta Maria, who caused these graves to be here.
Henrietta Maria was a French Catholic, and at her court, Roman Catholicism was openly practiced. In 1630, she commissioned a Roman Catholic chapel to be built on this spot, the only one to have a legal existence in England at the time. Members of her household were buried here, and these are the last traces.
It was small concessions to Catholicism like these that ultimately cost Charles his life.
The vast majority of Charles's subjects saw him as dangerously soft on Catholics. The Gunpowder Plot showed that you couldn't trust Roman Catholics. Now, here was the king not just married to one, but allowing her to practice her faith in public. All good Protestants snarled.
And when Irish Catholics massacred Protestants in Ireland, these godly men, brought up on Fox's Book of Martyrs, wouldn't trust the king to put the rebellion down. So civil war broke out. Charles was defeated and put to death for endangering the Protestantism of this nation. Out of the chaos, one general, Oliver Cromwell, was left ruling these lands. Yet the war led the English to think the unthinkable. It inadvertently opened up the first national debate about toleration. I met up with the historian Alexandra Walsham to talk about why.
Alex, it's odd, isn't it, that the Civil War period is the great clash of opposing intolerant ideologies, and yet at the end of it all, we've got much more of an idea of toleration. How do we get to that?
One of the consequences of the descent into civil war is the breakdown of control, the collapse of the institutions that had been responsible for harassing and repressing religious dissenters in the past. And there's been a total collapse of the mechanisms of press censorship. And into the vacuum of power has emerged a flood of radical sects that have begun to articulate ideas and to behave in ways that completely horrify their conservative contemporaries. Groups like the Quakers, who believe that the inner light that illuminates them is superior to the Bible, and groups such as the Ranters, whose views that the moral law no longer applies to them.
So they can say the unsayable suddenly. And I guess this is exciting, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's in a sense that capacity for people to articulate new ideas that allows calls for toleration to be brought into the public domain.
But with all these horrifying opinions around, why would tolerance be considered a virtue?
Toleration, of course, had hitherto been regarded as a recipe for social chaos, for political anarchy. But over time, people come to realise that the sky is not going to fall in. And some people are coming round to the view that toleration may in fact be a better solution to the problem of religious pluralism than the attempt to persecute religious dissent out of existence.
The Civil War had created a new climate. For the first time in their history, the English could openly voice ideas about tolerance. And the war also set another remarkable precedent. In 1657, this Jewish graveyard was opened on the orders of Oliver Cromwell, following a radical decision.
Against the advice of his closest counsellors, he decided to readmit the Jews. And so they came back, after an absence of 366 years.
It's a moment the English are proud of, their first step to creating a multi-faith society. But it had little to do with an enlightened commitment to diversity, and everything to do with Cromwell's obsessive Christian beliefs.
He was convinced that the end of the world, the last days predicted in the Bible, were just round the corner. Jesus would come again, the wicked would be judged. But Cromwell also knew that one thing needed to be in place before the last days were ushered in.
According to Scripture, for Christ to come again, the Jews had to be living in all four corners of the world. And that included England.
It was Cromwell's longing to speed up the return of Jesus which was behind his decision to let them back in, not a nice piece of Guardian reading liberalism at all.
The 17th century didn't just see the return of the Jews. Protestant dissenters like Quakers, Baptists and Ranters were now being heard. But they were still illegal. That was about to change in a great Act of Parliament, triggered once again by English terror of Catholics. Cromwell's Protestant rule had been short-lived, and in 1660 the monarchy was reinstated. In 1685, James II came to the throne. He was a convert to Catholicism and determined to improve the lot of English Catholics.
What this meant in practice was that he began to introduce Catholics into the army and the universities after a century of exclusion. And he began to put his supporters into positions of power in local and national government. The obvious aim was equality for his fellow Catholics in national life.
James really believed in religious toleration. In a remarkable speech, he said it made as little sense to hate people of differing Christian beliefs as it did to hate a black man.
Anglicans fumed. He must be stopped.
Politicians wrote to the Dutch Prince William of Orange, Protestant son-in-law to James, asking him to intervene and save Protestant England. Five months later, their prayers were answered. A Dutch monarch invaded these shores. It's become known as the Glorious Revolution. James II fled abroad. The Protestant hierarchy so hated Catholics that they'd rather suffer a foreign invasion than have a homegrown papist king. And this event had huge implications for Protestant dissenters, who'd eventually lent their support to this Anglican revolution.
This was a moment of unity for all Protestants, Anglicans and dissenters alike. The dissenters demanded a reward. And what they got from the new King William and the new Queen Mary was a law finally legalising all Protestant denominations.
It was known as the Act of Toleration. And the original is kept here, in the Parliamentary Archives.
We have every Act of Parliament in here, dating from 1497.
This was an act born out of the sheer hunger of the Church of England to cling to power in the face of a Catholic king.
Here we are, there's the Act of Toleration.
Oh, quite small.
Compared to some of them, yes.
Compared with some, yes.
Yes, it's not one of our bigger ones.
Let's have a look at it.
OK, let's go and have a look.
But while the motives behind the act were decidedly mixed,
Just take the tie off for you.
it's always been hailed as a defining moment in the story of English tolerance.
OK, I'll leave you to have a look at that then.
Thank you. So we've got the title straight away. An Act for exempting their Majesties' Protestant subjects dissenting from the Church of England from the penalties of certain laws. Now, we open it up. Now here you see the phrase, lovely phrase, some ease to scrupulous consciences in the exercise of religion. So what this act is saying is that dissenting bodies like Quakers or Baptists were no longer in any danger of going to prison for their beliefs. And better than that, if they signed up to certain specified Christian beliefs, then they could worship freely in their own buildings. So this really does look like a very significant act of toleration.
But looks can be deceiving. Many dissenters had wanted much more from the Anglicans: to be welcomed into a broad national church. All they got was grudging toleration, the right to their own places of worship. And there were many groups the Act failed to acknowledge at all. At the start of the 18th century, atheists, heretics and Catholics in England all still faced imprisonment for their beliefs. So what drove England's next move towards tolerance? Well, it was a tangle of motives: greed, power and religion. God was still making the English. In 1707, Protestant England and Scotland united to create Great Britain. Together, they forged a worldwide empire. And nothing brings back the memory of colonial expansion more than this: the trooping of the colour.
This is extraordinary. Here I am on a cold, wet June morning watching some of the greatest pageantry that we do in this country. English, imperial, what more could you want?
The empire is often seen as a symbol of intolerance of other cultures and beliefs. But in fact, it was this imperial expansion that saw the British embrace the idea of full-scale religious freedom for the first time. For many British Christians, these newly conquered lands were the ideal hunting ground for conversions.
Now, when the British Empire expanded, the Church of England expected to expand too. There were lots of people ready to convert the world to Anglicanism. But it didn't work out like that.
In fact, this mission to convert other nations to the Protestant faith was doomed to failure. And the British were forced yet further on the road to becoming a more tolerant nation. And the first to benefit were those traitors to the state, the Catholics. There's no house that better encapsulates the fortunes of English Catholics than this one. Since 1409, it's been the home of the Throckmortons, one of the oldest Catholic families in England. And it's through this one family history that you can trace how Catholicism was reintegrated into English society.
Before the Reformation, the Throckmortons were landed gentry, friends of kings. Then, in the Tudor age, many of them refused to give up their Catholic faith, and suddenly they were outcasts, frequent visitors to the Tower of London with some conspiracy or other, fatally involved with the Gunpowder Plot. But in the 18th and 19th century, this family, who'd been seen as religious terrorists, were to be welcomed back into the English establishment.
And here in the saloon is the evidence of that transformation and how it came about.
Now, here's a happy story. It's from the Times of 1831, and it's the result of the Berkshire election. And Sir Robert Throckmorton, 8th Baronet, has just been elected MP. Now, for 250 years, no Roman Catholics had been allowed to take public office. But now Sir Robert took the oath of allegiance and took his seat in the House of Commons, the first Roman Catholic since the Reformation.
The family had gone from violent subversives back to members of the ruling elite. It was a remarkable turnaround. And the Throckmortons themselves had done much to make it happen. From the late 1700s, they'd lobbied to change the perceptions of the powers that be. They reassured anxious Protestant politicians that although Catholics listened to the Pope on matters of faith, there was no question that they were anything less than loyal subjects of the Crown.
So, there was gentle political pressure at home, but just as important was the plain fact of the growth of the British Empire. First, the British conquered Minorca in the Mediterranean, and then Canada. Now, the population of these places was solidly Roman Catholic, but more to the point, the ruling classes were Roman Catholic, and they were not going to give up their religion without a fight. So the British had a plain choice: either lose their conquests or tolerate Roman Catholicism. And hey presto, they tolerated Roman Catholicism, and religious freedom came to the British dominions for the first time.
The government might be happy to tolerate Catholics, but what about the people? They'd been fiercely anti-Rome for as long as they could remember. It was the French Revolution that finally tipped the balance. Catholic refugees flooded into England to escape the guillotine. Pity replaced terror. The English now feared foreign revolution more than Catholic uprising. In 1792, Catholics were finally allowed to worship freely. And from 1829, they were once again able to take a full role in public life.
Priest holes like this were at last redundant. Coton Court, which had been a safe house for illegal Catholic missionaries in the time of Elizabeth, commandeered by Roundhead armies in the Civil War, sacked by anti-Catholic rioters in the Glorious Revolution, could finally relax.
It was a milestone. By the mid-19th century, the British could proudly claim to be tolerant of religious diversity. Well, Christian diversity anyway. The expansion of the British Empire didn't only challenge British ideas about toleration of Catholics. As the Protestant Brits arrived in India, they were greeted by an explosion of different religions. Hindus, Sikhs and Muslims seemed ripe for conversion. So in the early 19th century, missionaries descended on India in droves. The Honourable East India Company, the ruling British body in India, was the focus for much of this missionary activity.
So if we just take a sip.
I think so vulgar as lifting it to your lips.
I met up with William Dalrymple for a tea tasting from the subcontinent to discuss the effect of this clash of religions in India.
Well, the background to this is that by the early 19th century, you're beginning to get the missionaries turn up, and alongside that comes the notion that God has given the British their empire in order that they can spread the one true religion, which in their minds is Protestant Anglicanism.
So you're actually going to get something really rather disastrous happening out of this.
Well, indeed something very disastrous does happen very quickly. It's this that angers Indians who are worried about forcible conversion, which is indeed being discussed among a small minority of extreme evangelicals. And you have the great explosion against that happening in 1857 at the uprising that we call here in Britain still the Indian Mutiny, but which in India has long been known as the First War of Independence.
So this is a religious war?
Certainly in the main centres such as Delhi, the rhetoric is almost entirely religious. And what's most astonishing when you read the accounts of the padres and the regimental chaplains in 1857 is this astonishingly violent language they use. We today are brought up to think of Christianity as being a language of reconciliation and peace and brotherhood. The 19th century is not even a whiff of that. In 1857, Christianity is all about blood for blood. This General Neil, who's this evangelical general who's organising wholesale Christian genocide, saying that we must be God's avenging angels. So Christianity is seen as a militant force and reflect a genuinely bloody Al-Qaeda stroke Old Testament vengeful God.
The uprising of 1857 was a wake-up call for the British, and the disastrous Christian mission to India had a huge and unexpected impact on the nation's official attitude to religious toleration. The government in India was instructed by Queen Victoria to abstain from any interference with the belief or worship of any of our subjects. And back home, it ushered in a new era of much greater acceptance of other faiths. Here at Brighton Pavilion, there's evidence of just how far-reaching that change was.
The Pavilion is the famously silly and deliciously extravagant Georgian seaside retreat created by the Prince Regent. But a century later, it played a much more serious and rather admirable role in the First World War.
The Pavilion was converted into a hospital. And between 1914 and 1916, it was used for troops from the Indian Army who'd been injured while fighting for the British. Recruits came from across India's religious divides. And Britain saw in this hospital a way of showing it had learnt the lessons from the excesses of its missionary activities.
The army went to incredible lengths to respect religious and caste sensibilities in sanitation, food preparation. So there were separate water supplies for Muslims and Hindus on the wards, separate latrines, bathrooms, and no fewer than 9 kitchens for Muslims, meat-eating Hindus, vegetarian Hindus. Everything intended to keep all the faiths happy.
The meat for Hindu and Muslim meals was scrupulously prepared. Just down the road was Brighton's first halal butcher. But perhaps the biggest change was in the attitude of the authorities to Christian missionaries who tried to storm the pavilion with their evangelism.
In a report to the War Office, the King's Commissioner for the Welfare of Indian Troops wrote that he had seen translations of the Gospels at the pavilion, but that he had orders that they should be strictly excluded. He also said that he had daily requests from clergy or missionaries to gain admittance to the hospital, to which he replied that if it were abroad that any attempt had been made to proselytize men who were sick or wounded, there would be great trouble.
The British government knew that success in the war was dependent on Indian support. And the hospital, heavily promoted in the media, showed that the British were now treating Indians with respect.
Ironically, you could say that the change was the work of fanatical Christian missionaries. The very fact that they'd called Hindus and Muslims reptiles and demons in the Great Indian Rebellion and advocated indiscriminate slaughter triggered a backlash in the form of greater respect for other faiths.
Just as with every other push towards English toleration, these 20th century roots of our multi-faith society were inextricably tangled up with religion. Today, a commitment to toleration has become one of the defining characteristics of the English. The nation prides itself on being a global trailblazer in the fight for individual freedom of expression. But it's sobering to realise that the journey to achieve it was motivated not by good intentions, but by fear.
Whatever happened to be the prevailing paranoia of the times, that was what forced tolerance or intolerance onto the English psyche. The medieval fear of hell, the Protestant terror of Catholics, the imperial nightmare of losing a grip on power. These were the elements that fueled change.
The English may have quite a few illusions about their history as a tolerant people, but they've got there anyway. And whatever they think about their past, let's hope that toleration, indifference to difference, remains as part of their future. In the final episode, is there an ethnic core to Englishness?
In this series, I've been arguing that God made the English. But did he also make them white and Christian?